Hey everybody, today we're going to talk about finding equivalent fractions. So there's a couple vocabulary words that we need to know in order to do equivalent fractions and to complete tonight's homework. One of those words is unit fraction. So a unit fraction is a fraction that has 1 as the numerator or a 1 on top. So for example, we could have 1/4, 1/10, 1/23. Any fraction with a 1 on top is a unit fraction, okay? The other vocabulary word that we need to know is equivalent fractions, okay? So fractions that have the same value, but they may look different or drawn differently. So for example, at the bottom, we see that there's 1/2 is equivalent to 2/4. It's still only half the box, but we can split that box up in more parts and give it a different name. It's the same value, but it could be drawn differently, okay? Or it can look different. Equivalent fractions, okay? And that's what we're finding today. Let's get started. Okay, so first things first is we know that we need to cube the directions. So I need to draw horizontal lines to decompose each rectangle. Now in class we learned that whenever we see that word decompose, we're going to think of ourselves break down or break apart. So we're breaking apart those rectangles into the number of rows as indicated. We're going to need to use the model to give the shaded area as both a sum, which is adding of those unit fractions, just like we talked about, and as a multiplication sentence. Okay, so I've put my symbols for adding and multiplying there so I don't forget. I need to have both of those. Okay, so when I look at the tape, right away, I know that I have 1/4. That's what they're showing me. I have 4 total boxes, which is our denominator, and I have 1 shaded in, and so that's my numerator. It's showing 1/4. So in the directions, it said that I needed to draw a horizontal line so that I have 2 rows. So to get 2 rows, I draw 1 horizontal line. And that's going to give me a new fraction. So now if I look at how many boxes I have 8 boxes and I have 2 shaded in. So 1/4 is equivalent to 2/8. Now I have to write that as a sum of unit fractions and as a multiplication sentence. So we can think of this as a story, and that's how we do this in class. So we start with the beginning of story, a fraction in the beginning. We change it, or something happens to it, and then we end up with a fraction at the end. So if we do a sum of unit fractions, we started with 1/4, and I need to add fractions to get to 2/8. And since it needs to end in 8s, my unit fraction needs to be in 8s. So I will have 1/8 plus 1/8, and that will give me my 2/8. Okay, so if I go back, it's really just counting the shaded boxes. I have 1/8 here, 1/8 here, and together that equals 2/8. Okay, so I've done the horizontal line. I broke apart that rectangle to show the number of rows, and I used the model to add. But I have not shown it in a multiplication sentence yet. So I'm going to set up my story again. Fraction in the beginning. Something's going to happen to get us a new fraction at the end. So at the beginning of my story, I started with 1/4. And at the end of my story, I ended with 2/8. So I can bounce around and fill in what I know. Okay, and I know that I started with 1/4. And it wants me to multiply 1/4 by something. Okay, it told me to use multiplication to get to the 2/8 at the end. So now I just fill it in. 1 times something will equal 2. And in this case, 1 times 2 equals 2. Now we have a rule with fractions. Whatever you do at the top, you have to do on the bottom. So because I multiplied by 2 on the top, I have to do that same thing on the bottom and put the 2 there. And I can check it to make sure it makes sense. 4 times 2 is 8. So I know that works. So I was able to write my multiplication sentence as well. All my action words have a check mark in them, so I know I'm done. Let's do this another way. In these problems, they did not give us the area model. They want us to draw our own area models to show the decomposition. I'll put that in red so it follows our pattern. And then it wants us to represent the decompositions as that sum again, using the unit fractions, and as that multiplication sentence. And we can think of it as those stories just like we did before. So the only difference this time is we need to draw the tape. So it gave us 1/3 equals 2/6. So I will start with my 1/3. Show that first. And then, just like I did before, I'm going to draw that horizontal line to show that my 1/3 can become 2/6. And now I just write that story. So I have the beginning of my story is 1/3, and I know it's going to be the beginning no matter what I'm doing, adding or multiplying. And I know the end of my story will be 2/6 no matter what, whether I'm adding or multiplying. So I can fill in those pieces right away. So I've drawn the area model to show the decompositions, and now I'm representing those decompositions as a sum. And I know that sum is to add and multiply is to multiply. So I need to use those unit fractions. So let's fill them in. If I'm working in sixths, this box would be 1/6, and this box would be 1/6. So when I add them together, 1/6 plus 1/6 equals 2/6. Now let's do my multiplication. In the beginning of the story, I had 1/3. At the end, I need to end up with 2/6. So we had 1/3, and I need to multiply it by something to get to 2/6. 1 times 2 is 2. Whatever you do to the top, you must do to the bottom. So if I put 2 on the bottom as well, 3 times 2 equals 6. And it works. I found the sum, and I multiplied. All my action words have a check mark in it. I know I am done.